Forget everything you know about carbohydrates because it's probably wrong. Good, bad, fattening, slimming. There's so much noise out there that it's overwhelming. So let's start again. And by the end of today's episode, you're going to understand what carbohydrates really are, how they can help you to exercise and stay healthy, and learn how some of the myths that are rife on the internet are so amazingly wrong. Hey, and welcome to Vegetarian Health and Longevity, the podcast where we cover amazing topics that help vegetarians live longer in better health. I'm your host, James LeBague, and I get to interview expert guests and also share my own experiences working as a sports nutritionist and as an advanced clinical practitioner in family medicine. The wonderful carbohydrate. The evil carbohydrate. If you ask around, you'll get both of these views on them. Logic suggests that both can't be correct. Let's take it back to the basics and talk about energy. I'm not talking about anything spiritual here. I'm talking about plain, hard energy. What your body uses to power everyday movement and exercise. Your body uses a mix of fats and carbs, and the amount varies depending on what you're doing, which we'll cover shortly. But suffice to say, your body uses carbohydrates, and if we're being more specific, glucose. The other sugar to mention is fructose, and these two are both what we call simple sugars or simple carbohydrates. Glucose is the main energy currency that our body uses. When you eat carbohydrates, these are typically broken down into glucose and fructose. So let's say you eat rice. That's a big long chain of glucose in the form of starch. That's then broken down into glucose. Now there are some complex mechanisms, but that glucose can then be used for either immediate energy or stored in your muscles as glycogen. Now the same energy principles apply to exercise too, in that your body uses fats and carbs. If you're doing some easy exercise, so something where you're moving but you're not particularly out of breath, you'll use a balanced mix of fats and carbohydrates. But as the exercise intensity increases, you shift more towards using carbohydrates. Now, this is due to carbohydrates being more efficient in that you need less oxygen to create energy compared to using fat. The other massive thing to say here is that you have to have oxygen to be able to metabolize or burn fat for energy. This means that for high intensity training, carbohydrates are your primary energy source. So if you aren't consuming carbohydrates in your diet, then you're going to struggle with high intensity exercise. So most likely you'll feel sluggish, you'll feel rubbish, and it's going to be really hard to actually get out there and do the training. And also from my experience of working with amateur and professional athletes, I can tell you that many people overestimate their ability when it comes to exercise. What they call easy training is often far harder, so what they are inadvertently doing is working at a higher intensity than they planned, which again means that they're going to be burning more carbohydrates, so need more of them in their diet than they realize. So what I want to highlight is that you need carbohydrates just for day-to-day living. So your organs and your brain, for example, need carbohydrates and glucose in particular, but you also need it when you exercise too, and that goes for easy or high intensity exercise. If you're looking to try the vegetarian diet and you're not sure where to start, then we've got you covered. We have free meal plans available on our website for whatever your goal, whether that's weight loss, muscle gain and toning, or just generally healthy living. Head to hurrythefoodup.com/try. That's TRY. To check them out and download your free plan and get started. Now I'm going to give some nuance later on into how many carbohydrates you should eat in a day. But first I want to just go back to those terms that I mentioned earlier, glucose and fructose. These are what we call simple carbohydrates, but there's also complex carbohydrates too, which in simple terms is a longer chain of these simple carbohydrates, and more specifically glucose. So when you think about rice, pasta or bread, that's simply a long chain of glucose molecules all paired together to make that more complex carbohydrate structure. The name dictates how easily these are broken down and used for energy. So Simple carbohydrates are easily broken down, digested, and absorbed, whereas complex carbohydrates are harder and take longer to break down and absorb for energy. Now, the type of exercise that you're doing and the duration of the exercise can actually dictate what type of carbohydrate you should be consuming, because they have different purposes and different benefits depending on the context. Typically, simple sugars or simple carbohydrates are best used either immediately before exercise, during exercise, or after exercise to help with recovery, because what you're trying to do is absorb that carbohydrate at a quicker rate so that your body can use it for energy and process it quicker than a complex carbohydrate. So if you think that you've done a particularly grueling or hard high intensity session, or you've done a race like a half marathon, then simple sugars can actually really help to speed up your recovery, because you help to replenish your glycogen stores, which are your body's store of carbohydrates, at a quicker rate. This is useful, and typically when I've worked with athletes who have been struggling with their recovery but do quite a lot of exercise, this is one area where we can refine and improve their nutrition, and it makes a massive difference. When it comes to consuming carbohydrates before exercise, the way to think about it is that the closer you are to the start of your exercise, the better simple sugars are over complex sugars, because it reduces the risk of gastrointestinal symptoms. Now, depending on what you're doing, this might not be as much of an issue. So, for example, if you're going to be doing some low intensity exercise and perhaps you're doing swimming or you're cycling, it might not make much difference. But if you're going to be running or doing high intensity training, because the simple sugars are easier to digest, they are less likely to still be in your gut and cause symptoms when you're training, such as bloating, diarrhea, or cramps. For most people, though, a standard meal containing complex carbohydrates within 45 minutes of finishing exercise is perfectly suitable and should cover all of your body's needs. When I'm working with clients, I try to encourage them to have wholemeal varieties or brown varieties of carbohydrates. So we're thinking of things like whole grain rice or pasta or wholemeal bread. There are a couple of benefits to doing this. The first is that whole grain varieties will typically contain more protein and more fiber, which will make someone feel more full and satisfied with eating, but also mean that that should help with their recovery because of the higher protein content. As well as that, they typically have higher amounts of micronutrients. So think of your vitamins and minerals. And for example, bread will often contain extra calcium or niacin, and you get similar in rice or pasta. So you may have guessed it, but I'm a fan of including carbohydrates in your diet. The majority of your energy from carbohydrates should come from those complex carbohydrates that I've mentioned. And good examples are rice, pasta, quinoa, bread, and oats. A smaller amount of your energy from carbohydrates should come from simple carbohydrates, which might be from fruit like bananas and apples. These are also great to include in your diet because fruit also contains lots of micronutrients as well as fiber, and it contributes to a good overall nutritional profile. Now, one thing that often surprises people when I work with them on a one-on-one basis or when I do group talks is my stance on sweets and confectionery. I don't think that they should be an everyday thing, but they shouldn't be demonized. But I think it's a trap that a lot of people fall into. Let's go back to the start when I said that simple sugars are just energy and nothing more. We're going to cover this later on when I bust some myths, but this is something which I hope I'm going to change your mind on by the end of this episode. Now, you might be thinking, all right, I get it. Carbs, they're good. Or at least I hope you do now. How much should you eat? How many carbohydrates should you consume a day? A really nice way to go about it is to split your plate up into quarters. This doesn't work for everything, but it's a really good rule of thumb, and it's something that you can think about with the meals that you prepare at home. My suggestion is that a quarter of your plate should be carbohydrates, another quarter of your plate should be protein, and half of your plate should be non-starchy vegetables. Then to top it off, like the icing on the cake, you have a sprinkling of fat on the top of it. So that might be a small portion of nuts or seeds, a little bit of cheese or some oil. But the main thing is that fat shouldn't be a huge part of the plate. Now, I typically suggest a portion of carbohydrates with every main meal. And that's because of how many carbohydrates your body actually needs to function. As a rough number, your brain needs about 200 grams of carbohydrates, or more specifically glucose, per day to function, and your total carbohydrate needs are somewhere around 250 grams without exercise accounted for. As a bit of context for you, there are roughly 25 grams of carbohydrates in a banana, 60 grams in 100 grams of pasta, and 30 grams in 50 grams of oats. So that should give you an idea that you really do need to make sure that you consume them in your meals. If you want to be a bit more technical than that, then the current UK NHS guidance and the guidance from the British Nutrition Foundation is that 50% of your food intake should be from carbohydrates. So if you're consuming 2,000 calories a day, then 50% is 1,000 calories. There are 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate, so that means 250 grams of carbohydrates. Yeah, maths. So let's get into the bit that I've been most excited about. We're going to go through 3 myths and break them down. The first is that carbohydrates make you fat. This just isn't true. The most important thing when it comes to weight, and this goes for weight loss, weight maintenance, or weight gain, is calorie balance. If the amount of calories that you consume are roughly equal to the amount of calories that you expend, then your weight is going to stay the same. And exactly the same goes for weight loss and weight gain. So if you're eating more calories than you're expending, you'll put on weight. And if you're expending more calories than you're consuming, you'll lose weight. Now, it realistically doesn't matter how many carbohydrates you eat for this process to happen. You can eat loads of carbohydrates and put on weight, and you can eat loads of carbohydrates and lose weight. We know this from the evidence that people can lose weight on high carbohydrate or low carbohydrate diets. So the carbohydrate itself is not the important thing, it's calorie balance. Now, yes, there might be individual differences and there's differences depending on what sort of diet someone prefers. But at the end of the day, carbohydrates do not make you fat in isolation. The second myth I would like to bust is that low carbohydrate diets are helpful for sports. Realistically, there are very few scenarios, and this is backed up by evidence, where low carbohydrate diets are superior to carbohydrate-rich diets. And this is particularly true for any sport that involves high intensity or training for a long period of time, so think endurance sports. You only have a limited store of carbohydrates, and we're talking enough for about 90 minutes of hard, steady exercise, but that's when you're stocked up at full capacity. Most people aren't going to be like that. And like I mentioned earlier, you need carbohydrates to power high intensity exercise. So if your goal is to do some high intensity training and you're not consuming carbohydrates, it's going to mean that that session is less productive and you're probably going to feel absolutely rubbish. And because you use carbohydrates, whether you're doing low or high intensity exercise, if you're simply training for long periods of time, so people who are training for marathons or long distance triathlon, then you need a constant supply of carbohydrates. The suggestion is that by following a low carbohydrate diet, you become fat adapted, so you become less reliant on carbohydrates. Now, that is true, but when you balance that against the potential risks from following a low carbohydrate diet, it's very clear from the evidence that most people shouldn't be doing it. So my advice is that unless a healthcare professional like a registered dietitian or your doctor has specifically suggested you should follow a low carb diet, you shouldn't do it. Now, the third myth that we're going to bust here is that junk food is bad. Now, hear me out. There's a bit more to it. It's not something that should factor in every meal, and it probably shouldn't happen every day either. But at the end of the day, junk food is simply calories. And like I mentioned earlier, you can lose or gain weight by eating literally any food if you eat enough of it. So this is actually one of those things where there needs to be context, because that is way more important. And what I encourage clients that I work with is that it's much better to understand context and have a good relationship with your food. So that means that you can eat so-called junk food because it can fit in your diet. It doesn't mean that it has to be banned and that you should fear it, but instead it should just be in moderation. What we also know is that if someone enjoys the diet that they're trying to follow, they are way more likely to stick to it over the long term. And that's what we're looking for here. Whether you're looking to lose weight or maintain your weight and just stay active and healthy, we want you to be eating a predominance of good, healthy food. If part of that means that you occasionally eat some chocolate or some cake, then that's good and you should do that. A fun way is to also think about the individual ingredients in that food. So let's take cake as an example. Most of the time, that's going to contain some sugar, eggs, and flour. Is there anything inherently wrong with those things? No. And actually, lots of people will eat flour every single day and will eat eggs every single day because both of those in context can be healthy food. So then you think, okay, so there's some sugar in it and there's some added butter and extra things in it, and it becomes overall less healthy than, say, eggs on toast. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. So remember, the basic unit of a carbohydrate is a simple sugar or simple carbohydrate, with the most common and most important being glucose. It is literally just a unit of energy, and nothing more than that. Simple sugars are best used directly before, during, and after exercise, and complex carbohydrates are better for your main meals. Most people should include a source of carbohydrates with every main meal, filling a quarter of their plate. Carbs don't make you fat. That's eating too many calories. Carbs do contribute to better health and better exercise. Now, hopefully this episode has been eye-opening for you, and you have a better understanding of what carbohydrates are and why they're so important. If you did find it useful, then I would really appreciate it if you gave this a 5-star review. It will only take you a minute and it will help the podcast spread to more people and help them develop an amazing relationship with their food.